Hello you guys, welcome back to my channel. I could not be more excited for today's video. To all the palettes I've loved before. Today we are going to be talking about every single eyeshadow palette I have ever mentioned as a favorite on my channel. We're going to talk about what truly was a love, what may have been a lost love, a palette I may have just been in lust with and it was a mistake, and all of the in-between. I don't even know really. There's the train. While the train's honking its horn, I'll quickly say, I think maybe because of the lighting, it kind of looks like I have like a shadowed bruise over on my face. I promise I don't. I'm like gonna scoot close. Hopefully that doesn't actually come through, but anyway, I saw Hannah, let me just like quickly explain to you. I'll post a timestamp in case you don't want to hear about the conception of this video idea. Hannah Louise Poston had posted like all of her declutters like in one video, and I was like, oh, it'd be fun to go back and look at every eyeshadow palette that I've ever decluttered. That's gonna take even longer. I've been working on that list, but I'm thinking for my end of March palette week, you might see that. But then I was laying in bed one night as I was like researching to potentially talk about every eyeshadow palette I've ever decluttered, and this To All the Palettes I've Loved Before popped into my head. There's a book called, I think, To All the Boys I've Loved Before. So I don't know if like I had just seen something about that book or whatever. And then I was like, ooh, what if I talked about every eyeshadow palette that has ever been a favorite? And so the wheels started churning in my mind, and it took like a week of me like going through and trying to find either every favorites video, every like if my house was burning down, these are the palettes I would grab. And then also the last few years I've only ranked my like year-end palettes. I didn't do like a year-end favorite palettes. So I would do like my top 10 in my ranking. I did just post an updated top 15 eyeshadow palettes in my collection, because as I was researching for this video, I was like, oh my gosh, I don't have like these are truly the top. I did post like a current top 10 of all time, but like it's a little bit different. Anyway, you guys, that is what today's video is going to be about. I literally have 6 pages of palettes to talk to you guys about. So if you're interested, stay tuned. First, if you haven't yet subscribed to my channel and you like project planning content, palette themed content, or just chit chatting about makeup, I'd love if you'd consider subscribing before moving on. And other than that, let's jump into the video. Okay, you guys, I just finished filming this video and I'm popping back in really quick to say this video is going to be long, and as someone who gets hangry, I would recommend maybe just like pausing for a moment, go grab anything. Grab a Snickers. You aren't you when you're hungry. Grab something, snack, coffee, tea, water. It's gonna be a long one. You guys, I have been wanting to film this video for over a week, but I've been like, how do I want to film it? Like, what do I do? And I think I'm just gonna go year by year and talk about favorites. I thought about like tallying up how many times a palette was mentioned, but then that was getting overwhelming with like my 6 pages of notes. So I was like, I'm just gonna go year by year. So we can start with 2017, and it was just like talking about a favorites. It wasn't a dedicated palette video, and it's so funny. I can kind of like see, like as I was watching the progression of my channel, kind of see when I like really started to get into palette content or just eyeshadow palettes in general. But in 2017, I mentioned, and I'm going to scoot over to post pictures of anything that I don't have, I mentioned the ColourPop Elements of Surprise palette, and I do remember really loving that palette for such a long time. I believe it had like a pop of pink in it, and if I'm remembering correctly, it had more like cool tone matte brown shades. You know what? If they re-release this, I feel like I would be inspired to like purchase this. I don't really remember at what point I ended up decluttering this. I believe it was just getting older in my collection. And I also feel like I used to feel like I had to declutter things. And now I'm like, I want to declutter things because I have too many options, but like, I feel like that may have been one of those palettes that like I decluttered a little too early, although at this point it would be extremely old in my collection, so it is what it is. But that was the only mentioning of like a palette favorite that I could find in 2017. Okay, then we move on to 2018, and there's 2 videos I could find where I talked about palette favorites. Up first, we had top 5 neutral palettes, but I actually have 7 palettes listed in that. So first palette mentioned was the Tarte Love Trust and Fairy Dust palette, which I just recently decluttered, I believe last year. I absolutely loved this palette. This definitely was, and if it hadn't gotten so old, I still feel like I would have kept that palette around, but it was starting to it was crumbling, it had been dropped, shades were breaking off. There were 2 specific shades, one dusty purple shade I can remember loving so much, and then one like metallic mauve. I still feel like if that palette hadn't gotten sold, I would still like it, and I didn't plan on picking that palette up. That was like a packaging made me buy it sort of palette. So that was mentioned. Also, the Huda Beauty Warm Brown Obsessions palette. As I was going back, I was like, I forgot about the original Huda Obsessions palettes, and I loved them. I wanted every single one. I owned every single original Huda Obsessions palette. Like, I really did love them. They came traveling with me all of the time. The Warm Brown, I feel like, especially now, I just don't love like a super warm brown. Like, it just, they weren't my tones. They weren't my tones. Like, if I were to like re-meet Huda Warm Browns, I would say, not my type anymore. Not at all. ColourPop Dream Street I mentioned. Loved that palette. I feel like ColourPop Dream Street is like a lost chance love. Like, I wish that didn't get old. That is one that like I noticed a decline in the quality, and actually I had depotted a couple of singles. The matte navy from that palette I still own. That performs really well. But like my favorite shade out of that palette, I believe it was called Kaleidoscope, either that or Mermaid Boy. I just recently pulled that single to try and use, and the quality just isn't there anymore. But that palette, like if that palette were to be re-released, I would take my chances with it. Those were some really lame snaps. Okay, the Ciate London Pretty Fun and Fearless palette. Also really loved this palette at one point in time. That was a cool tone palette as well. And again, I feel like if that were re-released, that would be like a second chance romance sort of situation. Like, I feel like I would really enjoy that palette these days. Only thing I will say is I feel like the metallics wouldn't be like intense enough for me in like this day and age. But the mattes, I feel like I really would love that color story now. Tartelette in Bloom. My original Tartelette in Bloom that I owned in 2018 got too old. That had multiple pans in it. If you guys know how hard it is to hit pan in a Tartelette in Bloom, like that palette got so much use, I repurchased it because I love it so much. So this is like, yes, definitely a true love. It's not the most special eyeshadow palette of all time, but for work, for travel, for just something that's got your back, Tartelette in Bloom is a great palette. So obviously that was a love. Okay, I also mentioned the Zoeva, who remembers Zoeva, by the way? Zoeva Cocoa Blend. Who remembers that palette? Everybody and their mother was talking about that palette. I feel like this is one of those where like I felt like I had to love it because everyone did. Granted, there were some really nice, just simple matte shades in there, but I remember thinking at the time even like, what is so special about this palette? Like, I feel like I thought it was a favorite because everyone talked about it, but when I reflect on it, I'm like, was it really a favorite? If this palette walked by me on the street in this day and age, it would just walk on by and I wouldn't even do like, I wouldn't even like turn my head. Too boring for me. And the last palette mentioned in that video was the ABH Soft Glam palette. I loved this palette for so long. This is another one I feel like I maybe decluttered too early. Like, I feel like Soft Glam is just like a perfect warm palette. Now granted, again, metallics, I don't know if they would be metallic enough for me. Like, I feel like this would be like that, ooh, like if I were to relate Soft Glam to a boyfriend, I feel like this would be like that, like almost like maybe like you guys have been like best friends for like a long time. It's always got your back, but then like maybe you go to have like a one night stand and you realize like you take that test drive, but then like maybe you go and like have one wild night together for the first time. Like, it's like you take that test drive and you realize like maybe it's just not the right size. And you realize at that moment, maybe it's just not the exact right thing. that you want for like the rest of your life. That's how I would classify the ABH Soft Glam. That mulberry shade, like that just will forever stick out in my mind. There's a couple matte shades in that palette that like I really do love, but like you have to have the mattes as well as like the fun shimmers, just like, you know, in your boyfriends. You have to have like the reliable, but you also have to have the fun, you know? Okay, then 2018, end of year favorites. I mentioned Zoeva Cocoa Blend again. Oh, by the way, I meant to say 2017 Elements of Surprise. I think that was the only time I mentioned that palette as a favorite. Okay. Also mentioned Soft Glam as a favorite at the end of 2018. Natasha Denona Lila. This truly was a favorite at that time. One, I think because I spent so much money on it, but two, I just remember a couple of looks that I created back in 2018. Even like watching videos back, I was like, oh, I remember how much I loved that look. I really loved this bottom row of shimmers, and I need to show this palette some more love because this palette is getting old. This actually is a palette that is included, or a product that's included in these products will self-destruct if I don't use them. This is something I will at one point in my life. I feel like this will be like one of my first things that I like retire, but like keep it in my collection to like show, but like don't actually use. But I mean, you can see this palette has definitely gotten love for me in its lifetime. This is not a favorite anymore. Even like, I do love this like green to red duochrome. I still love this shade right here and this purple, but there's definitely more impressive shades throughout like indie brands and stuff. So I'm like trying to think of how I could relate that to dating as well. And I'm like, okay, girl, we don't need to relate every palette to dating in this video. Okay. Oh yes, oh my gosh, you guys, I mentioned the Dose of Colors Baked Browns palette, which this is also in my products will self-destruct, and I don't want to spoil it because I don't want to show you like my progress on one of the shades in here, but I've been reaching for this so much. I do remember absolutely loving this. This is like the tried and true trusty, it's always got your back. This came traveling with me everywhere. It is 5 just matte shades, but honestly, just for like a very utilitarian palette to like have your perfect just baked brown shades, perfect. I honestly would say like this is still something, especially now that I've like pulled it out. I'm like so happy to have this in my collection. I feel like this definitely serves a purpose. So that's an old favorite that's still working well. The Huda Smoky Obsessions palette. This is the one that got away. Okay, I absolutely loved that Obsessions palette. It was my favorite of all, I think of all the Obsessions palettes that have ever come out. But mine, I took it traveling with me everywhere, and eventually like I had so many broken shades. I had dropped the palette a couple times, and you can't, as far as I know, they don't sell this one anymore. If they did, instantly I would buy Huda Smoky Obsessions. It was just perfect for like a smoky eye that I felt comfortable in. Ugh, I still miss Smoky Obsessions. All right, you guys, moving on to the year of 2019. We have, how many? I think I have 4 2019. Yes, I have 4 2019 videos. Okay, so we first up had If I Could Only Keep 10. I'll leave my playlist, my eyeshadow palette playlist link down below. I don't know if I'll be able to link every single video. Like, I don't know if my description box will be long enough, but I'll link my eyeshadow palette playlist. You can find all these videos in that playlist if you want to go laugh at how I used to do my makeup. I was like, girl, you used to wear so much highlighter. I was like, wow. Anyway, okay, If I Could Only Keep 10 in 2019. It would have been the BH Cosmetics Weekend Festival palette, which I will say, I adored that palette when I had it. I believe I decluttered that. I finally came to terms with the fact that I was ready to let go of it last year in my declutter. I'm gonna add a little bit more lip gloss just because it was getting quite old. I noticed a decline in the quality. I do kind of miss that one though. Fond memories with that palette that like, especially for like approachable color, it was $20. I also used to be like a festival girly, so like there was just a lot of like nostalgia. In fact, if that's still at my mom's house, that might be a makeup piece I retire, but still like keep around for the memories. I mentioned ColourPop Dream Street in the 2019 If I Could Only Keep 10. Again, I did really, that was a palette that I feel like I wouldn't stop talking about. I remember talking about that all the time. Then I mentioned the Alamar Cosmetics Volume 1 eyeshadow palette. I do remember I really loved this eyeshadow palette for that green metallic shade. I no longer own this palette. In fact, I think I've decluttered this a couple of years ago, but I actually ended up depotting either 3 or 4 of the shades out of that palette. So I liked the palette for some of the shades. They were a bit different from like what I would normally reach for, but then there were other shades in there that I just was never reaching for. So I'm actually kind of surprised I included this in palettes I would keep if I could only keep 10. Granted, my makeup collection was significantly smaller in 2019, and I feel like I wanted it specifically for that like metallic green. But when I reflect on all of my favorite palettes, like I kind of forget about this palette even being around. Okay, then I also mentioned the Juvia's Place Magic palette, which I think I wanted to keep that one. Keep 10 isn't necessarily like my tippity top favorite, so maybe I shouldn't have included this, but I also just wanted to include more to talk about. But I think I wanted that because it had like colorful metallics. I have since decluttered that palette. Juvia's Place just does not make my favorite eyeshadow formula. I still think that palette is pretty though. Like I still sometimes see people pull that out. I'm like, I kind of wish I still owned that. I owned the larger one and they've come out with a mini. And like a part of me has like wanted to buy it before, but then I'm like, girl, you don't even like the formula. So I also mentioned the Sephora Pro Editorial palette. Who remembers that? For the color. I wish I didn't declutter this palette, honestly. I feel like I would have much more of an appreciation for this palette now that I feel more comfortable playing with color. That also was like a really heavy palette with a really large mirror. I maybe sold this palette. I don't think I own this one. Like I don't think it's sitting at my mom's in like my mom's makeup inventory. So that one kind of makes me sad. Although it wasn't like a favorite palette by any means. I also mentioned ABH Soft Glam again, as well as the Tartelette in Bloom. And then this is, and mine won't look, I'll post a picture because mine is currently a custom palette, but I mentioned the Natasha Denona Sunrise palette. This was the first Natasha Denona mini palette, and I was obsessed with this palette when this first launched. I loved the color story. I especially loved the shade Laurel in this palette for like a shimmer on the lids. So freaking beautiful. This would definitely not be my favorite Natasha Denona midi anymore. Like I would say we would be like distant friends. Like we casually like could see each other and we would still get along, but like definitely not a favorite anymore, you know? I also mentioned Tarte Unleashed, which I did really love that palette in 2019. I was using that palette all the time. I remember talking about that palette quite a bit. I did eventually go on to declutter that eyeshadow palette. I just feel like better things came out. I will also say that Tarte just does not make my favorite eyeshadow formula. And I think even reflecting back, with the exception of the In Bloom, Tarte just didn't make my favorite eyeshadow formula. I liked that palette though because there were some pops of color that actually worked really well on the eyes, but I definitely don't miss this palette. Although I will say this one I do believe is still at my mom's, and I feel like I saw it and I was like, ooh, do I want to pull that back? And I was like, no. And then I also mentioned the Natasha Denona Lila palette in that video as well. I mean, if my house was burning to the ground and I could only keep 10, I would definitely want to keep this because I spent so much money on it. But okay, then we had the top 10 palettes in my collection for 2019, which I believe I posted shortly after I posted the If My House Was Burning. So I mentioned Huda Smoky Obsessions, which we've already talked about. Then I also mentioned Huda Mauve Obsessions, which I will say I was really into mauves back then. This would not be my like top choice for a mauve palette if this was out again. Like I would say like thank goodness we left that one behind. Definitely wouldn't be a favorite anymore. But I do remember using that palette quite a bit. I also mentioned Baked Browns again in the top 10. I also mentioned Tartelette in Bloom. We've talked about In Bloom 3 times already. Soft Glam got its 3rd mention. This is the first time I mentioned the ABH Mario palette, which is really interesting because I feel like I owned it before 2019, but this is the first time I mentioned it. That is a palette, that is another one that's like the one that got away, but my palette was so used and abused. Like I should have kept that one. I really should have, but I also tried to depot a couple of shades and then it was even more like broken. If this palette re-released, it wouldn't be a favorite. I like it for the mattes. The satins in that, but like there's something to be desired about, like if they would have the same shade in the satins, like that green and the blue, but it was like an intense metallic shimmer. Yes. But if they re-release this palette, I would buy this. Just, I loved that color story, especially the mattes. ColourPop Dream Street got its 3rd mention. Natasha Denona Lila got its 3rd mention. Dose of Colors Friendcation gets its 1st mention. Let me grab that. I literally just cleaned my makeup space and put all my palettes away yesterday, and now I'm gonna make another mess again. But Friendcation, still love this palette. This is one I feel like, I don't know if this maybe has to be like also a makeup souvenir. Like, I don't know if I'll actually like ever throw this one away. This has such fond memories tied to it as well. But that one got its 1st mention, and if I didn't mention BH Cosmetics Weekend Festival, got its 2nd mention. Right, and then top 5 palettes I tried in 2019. So these were palettes that I purchased in 2019 and tried for the first time. Okay, this is a good sign. I own 4 out of the 5 palettes mentioned in this video. So 4 of these you'll be seeing for the first time. This is the first. This is when I purchased the Natasha Denona Mini Nude palette. Mini Nude, yes. This is still a favorite in my collection. I literally just mentioned this in my top 15 palettes in my collection. 2019, okay, 20. We're on year 5 with this palette. Still a favorite. That is saying something. Pat McGrath Bronze Seduction. This is still like, I still love this eyeshadow palette. I do really love the Moonlit Seduction now, but I still love this palette. This is like what made me fall in love with, like fall even harder in love with green eyeshadow shades. Yeah, wow, love this. ABH Jackie released in 2019. We know I've had a serious love affair with this eyeshadow palette as well. This is a palette I don't love as much as I used to, but this still, like, I still do love this palette as a whole. It's just not a top, it's not in my top 15 anymore. But I love the shade Zam. I love these 3 matte shades. I love Sponsored, Lituation. And then we have the Dominique Cosmetics Latte palette, which I do remember really enjoying when I first brought this palette into my collection. I will say it's not a top reached for palette anymore. I always feel like this is like on the chopping block, and I don't know if it's just because it's like a standard everyday palette, but like so is this one. But then I like pull this palette out to use it to decide if I want to keep it, and like the quality is really good. So I don't know why I'm always like, do I actually need this? And then the 5th palette that was mentioned in this video was Tarte Unleashed, which again, I did really like that first like year or 2 that it was in my collection. And then the last 2019 video was the top 5 most used palettes in 2019. So we have BH Cosmetics Weekend Festival. Maybe as I edit this, you guys, I'll post on the screen the number, like what number mention we're on. I don't feel like I can fully keep track in my head, but I will as I edit, and then I'll post it on the screen. Then we have the Huda Smoky Obsessions palette again. We have the ABH Jackie palette. We have Tartelette in Bloom, so a couple already mentioned, love to see it. And then Urban Decay Born to Run, which I believe I was working on in an eyeshadow panning project that year, but I also do really love that, or not still, but I did really love that eyeshadow palette, and I used to talk about that all the time as a favorite as well. That's why I feel like I'm missing a couple favorites, or I'm like, maybe I would just, again, sneak them into like any video that I could talk about them. But okay, moving on to 2020, we have 1, 2, 3. Oh, I just realized my top 10 of 2020 I don't have listed. Okay, I might have to come like jump scare you at that point in time because I do work today. I'm filming before work. I don't have time to go research this, but I'll jump scare you in a bit. But that's not the video we're on. Okay, we have first video of 2020 talking about favorite eyeshadow palettes. We have If My House Was Burning. I'd grab these 10 palettes first. We have Dose of Colors Friendcation. We have BH Cosmetics Weekend Festival. This one gets saved again. We have ABH Mario, ABH Soft Glam. Again, we are seeing quite a few repeats. We have ABH Jackie, yes. We have Huda Smoky Obsessions. Again, most of these we're seeing like, we're on track. Like I really did like these palettes. I did continue to mention them. Then we have Persona Identity 1. This, I believe I'm like, yeah, it's sitting on my desk. I just mentioned this in 15 favorite palettes in my collection. This is still a favorite. Had Natasha Denona Lila mentioned again. This is the first time we are seeing Natasha Denona Gold mentioned, but I mean, I spent the money on it. I would definitely keep this, but this is like one of my most prized possessions, one of my most favorite palettes of all time. I also just mentioned this palette. I'm rooting if you haven't seen it. That one will be linked separately down below, my current top 15, but it does make me happy. Already like 3 palettes mentioned today are still tippity top favorite palettes, but gold I said I would grab if my house was burning. And then this is the first time we are hearing the Huda Beauty Mercury Retrograde palette mentioned, but this we had a serious love affair with as well. Over time, I fell out of love with this. Over time, I won't say grew bored with this, but I realized this is not my soulmate of a palette. I still have love and appreciation for this palette, fond memories, but this has been replaced with something younger and better. Okay, second video for 2020 was if I lost my entire makeup collection, I would buy these palettes first. Huda Mercury Retrograde palette. It was a serious love affair for a long time. We had a good connection. Okay, I mentioned the Sugar Pill Bite Size palette, which it surprises me, might surprise you. How cute is this? This holds a special place in my heart because this palette is like what I credit to wanting to dabble more in color and really becoming a little bit more comfortable in color. I really do, like, this is not a favorite palette in my collection, but it is a palette that I like really want to have in my collection and would really be sad if it wasn't in my collection, would really miss this palette. So I'm a little surprised I said I would buy these first, but I suppose if I wanted like a colorful palette because my entire collection was gone and I was missing it, like this would be a great place to start. I don't believe you can get this anymore, but then I mentioned ABH Soft Glam yet again. Urban Decay Born to Run I mentioned. Zona Identity got another mention, and this is where I get a little confused, but I will say I do like this palette is special and definitely brought something unique to my collection, especially at that time. Again, my palette collection was a little bit smaller. Melt Gemini. I love the outer packaging and artwork. I think they've updated it now, and I actually believe, if I'm thinking correctly, I like the old packaging better. This is just like Melt palettes are a little bit more finicky to work with. I find that it takes definitely more time, but for like a grungy look, like this definitely does and definitely did kind of spurt some sort of motivation or inspire something in me to like want to play around with color stories similar to this or play around with greens and things like that more. So that was mentioned. And then I also said the Natasha Denona Gold again. Yes, I would have spent $129 again if this needed replacing. Okay, next video was unexpected makeup favorites from 2020. Oh, not necessarily from that year, but unexpected makeup favorites in general. I had 2 palettes that I mentioned in that video. One was the BH Cosmetics Weekend Festival palette, which that would be an unexpected favorite because I really did love that palette, but it was a very colorful palette overall, so it was kind of unexpected that I fell in love with it as much as I did. And then the second was the Tarte Unleashed palette, which I feel like maybe I would have expected. I would have liked that one because I love Tarte Linden Bloom, but I guess it was unexpected. Yeah. Okay, now I'm going to jump scare you and chit chat with you about the top 10 palettes that I ranked in 2020, because this is where the end of year ranking started. Boom, jump scare you guys. I have my top 10 eyeshadow palettes from 2020. And as I look through my favorites from 2020, I'm like, it was a weird year in 2020, wasn't it? So this was ranking only the eyeshadow palettes that I tried in 2020, but still I'm like, girl, some of these I'm like, in 10th place in 2020, I ranked the Kaleidos Sashimi City palette. This is still a favorite. Like this should have been higher up in the ranking in 2020 because I still absolutely love and adore this palette. It's such a good one, great quality, beautiful intense metallics on the eyes, just so good. My number 9 spot went to the Lawless The Baby One eyeshadow palette, and I am not surprised that this was in my top 10 because I was constantly using that palette at the end of 2020. Like I use that all the time, and that truly was a favorite at the time. I have since gone on to declutter that eyeshadow palette. It just really was nothing special in my collection anymore. So I have gotten rid of that, but that was a true favorite in 2020. Then I mentioned my ColourPop Lil Ray of Sunshine palette, which I do really enjoy this palette, and I do remember really enjoying this when I first got it, but it is an all matte eyeshadow palette, and I am someone who cannot help myself. Like, I love to have a sparkle, a shimmer, something metallic on the lids. So this definitely wouldn't be a favorite today. Granted, I still do really enjoy having this palette in my collection. I feel like it does serve a purpose. I do like the curation of the matte shades, but this would just be more of a companion palette for me these days. So wouldn't be a favorite anymore. Then I did mention, where is it? It's in front of me. I did mention the Rowan 1111. This is when this first came into my life. This is not the exact same eyeshadow palette that I owned in 2020. If you haven't heard me say before, my daughter ruined my original one, so I instantly repurchased another one because I love this one so much. So this definitely would still be a favorite. The closer we get to like the top ranked palettes though of 2020, the dicier it gets. So then I mentioned the Huda Beauty Naughty Nudes palette, which I do like this palette, don't get me wrong. I think the reason that I mentioned this one at number or in my 2020 favorites at all is I believe this likely released towards the end of the year, so I was kind of in that new testing phase with it. It was something fun and fresh, but overall I don't feel like I would ever consider this like a true favorite in my collection. Although as I'm looking at this, I'm like, I really do need to pull this out for February because there are so many beautiful pink shades in this palette. But this is not like a tippity top favorite in my collection. So then I mentioned the Sydney Grace Tiny Marvels palette, and this truly is a palette that just doesn't get enough love for me in my makeup collection. It is such a beautiful palette. I love the curation of all of the shades. Such a beautiful color story. Probably the best like blue brown or green brown shade in my entire makeup collection, but sometimes I just forget that I own this, so I really do need to pull this out and focus on it. This needs to be no pan left behind in my collection this year, like even if it doesn't randomly get pulled in. Although maybe for the palette that I picked for myself in like April, I feel like this is giving April showers bring May flowers sort of vibes. So this doesn't get enough love, but it definitely is a phenomenal eyeshadow palette. All right, then I mentioned Melt Rust, which I did really enjoy this eyeshadow palette when this released. I just don't love Melt's formula like I used to. I just feel like their eyeshadow palette or their matte shades specifically are a little bit more difficult to work with, and I'd rather just work with like the Natasha Denona Biba palette, which I'm about to mention. I just feel like there's easier matte formulas to work with, but I do still love my Melt palette, so I couldn't get rid of them, but it's definitely not a favorite. Number 3 in 2020 was the Natasha Denona Biba palette, and I did really love this palette back in 2020 and still really love this palette. I pulled this palette out towards the end of 2023 in my No Pan Left Behind series, or I pulled it into a project to No Pan Left Behind this, and it reminded me of how great the quality is within this eyeshadow palette. Granted, I don't think that the metallic shades in this palette are going to be like the punchiest thing ever on your eye, but just for like a beautiful timeless eyeshadow look, this is such a great palette for that. So this would definitely still be a favorite in my collection. Coming in at number 2 in 2020, I had the Oden's Eye Solmani Original palette, which I did really love this palette in 2020 and went on to love that for a couple of years. I did recently declutter that because I have noticed Oden's Eye's formula has gotten progressively better as the brand has released more items. And a couple of my shades within that palette were kind of cracking and breaking. My favorite green shade in that palette broke altogether and was no longer in there. So then I was gonna try and depot a couple of the shades. I'm thinking of like the mustard yellow and the lavender shade that was in that palette, and it just didn't depot well. That experience did not go well in terms of depotting that palette. So I did end up just decluttering that one. That definitely wouldn't still be a favorite palette, mostly just because Oden's Eye's formula has come a long way since then, and I think there's better eyeshadows out there from Oden's Eye itself. And this is where I'm so confused, but I think I was in that honeymoon stage with this eyeshadow palette, but my number 1 palette in 2020 was the Naked Honey palette. I am not saying I dislike this eyeshadow palette, but I feel like I had purchased this towards the end of 2020, and so I was just starting to test this. I probably created some looks that I really loved. You're in those first few weeks of a relationship where like you're getting the best version of that person, and so like obviously you're in love, but then like as you progress along in your relationships, little things or like big red flags start to come up. There's no big red flags with this palette. It's just like not super exciting. Like we're better off as friends. Do you know what I mean? Okay. Jump scare over. Let's get back into the original programming. Okay, you guys, we're back to talk about 2021. I have only two videos to talk about from 2021. I have the 13 palettes I'd replace if I lost my collection. All right, we have 3 ColourPop palettes to kick that video off with. And we really have only talked about the ColourPop Elements of Surprise palette, but I have Little Ray of Sunshine. I do still have all 3 of these palettes, which I do declutter. It's easier for me, I feel like, to declutter ColourPop palettes because I spent less money on them. So it's a good sign I still own them all. But I have ColourPop Wild Child, I have ColourPop Going Coconuts, Little Ray of Sunshine, Going Coconuts, and then Wild Child. So I love Wild Child. I need to pull this out again. All right, then I mentioned Huda's Smoky Obsessions again. We loved Huda Smoky, clearly. Also Natasha Denona Gold. Again, I'm continuing to reiterate I would replace this. I would even pay the $129 again if I lost this palette. Okay, the Lunar Beauty Eternal Eclipse palette. I actually recently decluttered this. This was part of my Cool Tones chopping blocks. And this is something I do really like the color story, and at the time that I owned this, I do feel like it did add a uniqueness to my collection. But when I went to No Pan Left Behind it just was not sparking joy anymore. And I feel like because I have indie shadows, indie singles that just have more of like a punch and a pop to them, I didn't feel like that palette was anything truly special to my collection. And it wasn't something that I was reaching for, so I actually ended up decluttering that. I did mention the Huda Beauty Mercury Retrograde palette again, something I would replace if lost. And then I also mentioned Huda Beauty Naughty Nudes, which is interesting because, oh yeah, I do. Like, if I lost this today, I don't know that I would replace this palette. I love the Huda Beauty Rose Quartz palette so much. I don't feel like I necessarily would need both, but this is a really beautiful palette, and Rose Quartz hadn't released, I don't believe, at the time. So okay, I also mentioned the Kaleidos Sashimi City palette. Love this palette. Spoiler, it's a top 15 palette even still to this day. I'm keeping track of how many palettes are still favorites. Is it 1, 2? Oh yeah, 4 so far. 4. Okay, can we get to 5? Can we get to 5? I don't know. I mentioned the Nabla Side by Side palette in this video. I did really like that palette at this point. I was like loving everything Nabla at that point in time. There's definitely better. Like, there's definitely better now. Yeah, it just wasn't, you know, it just didn't perform the way that I've now experienced with other palettes. So I want the one that can perform at all times. And I know I'm always gonna get a good experience no matter like what shade we're using, no matter what we're doing, we're gonna have a good experience. I didn't find that to be the case with Nabla Side by Side towards the end. I mentioned Persona Identity 1 again, and then I mentioned the Glamlight Cake palette. And I'm pretty sure I included this because this is a really beautiful rainbow palette with a great color story, great quality. And if we're talking about palettes I would replace if I lost everything in my collection. So if I wanted something colorful, like this is a really nice, essentially rainbow palette to include. It's definitely not like, oh my gosh, like I absolutely must have this palette, but I see where I was going with that one. Other video in 2021, I have the 21 best eyeshadow palettes I tried in 2021. I know we're getting like really far into the video. I thought I had given myself plenty of time to film this video. Like I thought I was gonna actually be able to go work out for 30 minutes before going to work, but doesn't seem to be what's gonna happen, which is fine. Okay, so 21 best eyeshadow palettes in 2021. We have Sigma Corda Rosa. I do still really enjoy this palette. I think it's really beautiful. Definitely my favorite that I've tried from Sigma. I have the Kaleidos Club Nebula, which released in 2021. I loved this palette in 2021. I do still really enjoy this palette. It's definitely not like a favorite in my collection, but I think it's beautiful. And then Kaleidos Flower Punk. I do really like this palette. The color story is not every day for me, so like It's not a tippity top favorite, but I especially like these shades. Ugh, the packaging, the art, I really do love this palette. Okay, you guys, editing Steph is gonna hate this, but I think I'm actually just gonna post pictures of the palettes now, so I'm not pulling everything out to save a little bit of time on this end, on editing end, I get it. But Glamlite Chocolate Martini, I truly did love that palette, especially in 2021. I haven't reached for it as much in the years after that, but I really do need to pull that out. That is like a fun neutral palette. Like, you know, like a neutral with like a twist that like really does create something fun on the eyes. I really do. I still like that one. I just haven't reached for it much. Then we have the Odenzai Norns palette. I did really like this in 2021, and I actually recently no pan left behind at this palette and really created some looks that I had fun with. It is not the best formula. It is not my favorite ever, but you know, this is when I really started to try Odenzai, and I did really like that palette. Menagerie Pastel Pop, my first experience with really a pastel palette. I think there's better on the market now, but I still do like the palette and like Menagerie Cosmetics. Glamlite Ice Cream Dream, yes, such a good palette, even still to this day. I had so much fun reaching for that palette last year, and that continues to be, especially for a colorful palette, one of my most reached for favorite palettes to use. We also had Too Faced Natural Nudes. I reached for this so much in 2021. I think for an everyday neutral natural nude palette, this is perfect because there's like 3 tones. There's like warm browns, mauves, and something else. It works really well. It's definitely not a favorite palette, especially like now, but I did really like that. I also have the Aether Beauty Ambertine Quad. I do still really like this. I wouldn't consider it to be a favorite, but I really enjoy the one look I create over and over again when I reach into this palette. I also have the Huda Beauty Wild Tiger palette. I do really like this one. This is probably one of my top most favorite Huda Obsessions palettes, with the exception of obviously Smoky Obsessions. And then I have the Huda Beauty Rose Quartz palette, which is sitting in front of me, so I will mention this. This is still a favorite. Oh, we are up to 5. We're up to 5 palettes that are still favorites. Gorgeous, gorgeous color story. Love that. Okay, I mentioned Huda Muse in this, and I feel like I remember putting this video together and I was like, I don't like, this isn't a favorite, but I wanted to have 21 palettes to talk about. And I think I even said that in the video. I've decluttered this palette. It was a large palette, not the best quality I've ever tried, and just really, it just like, it's like one of those like one night, like you have a one night stand and then you're just kind of like, I'll be just like deleting your number. We never need to do that again. Maybe I'm being a little bit too harsh. The palette wasn't like that bad, but I'd have to be like really bored to not have to not want to like reach into other things, not want to call other people, you know what I'm saying? Okay, then we have NARS Summer Solstice. Ooh, we're up to 6. This is still a favorite. Found this in 2021. I'm forever a NARS fan now. I'm sold. Viseart Soleil La Plague, another favorite. We're up to 7 still favorites. Really do love that one as well. I'm trying to not like talk so much. ColourPop Cabana Club. I did really enjoy this in 2021. It would not be a favorite now. ColourPop Limoncello, yes. That's a tried and true trusty, always gonna have your back, always gonna support you, never gonna do you dirty. I do love ColourPop Limoncello. Ooh, ColourPop Wild Child gets another mention. I did really enjoy this palette. I need to reach for this one more. Nabla Side by Side. Nabla Side by Side gets mentioned again. Artist Couture Supreme Bronze. I didn't mention that in my current top 15, but that would have been like palette number 16. I do really love that palette. Perfect for travel, great packaging, great formula, never gonna do you dirty. Only thing is, it's like there's a little bit of a spark missing. And I think it's because now I love indie shadows. I like a punch on the eyes, whereas like this is just like a little bit more like subdued. And then I also mentioned the Lunar Beauty Eternal Eclipse palette again in that video. We are on to 2022. I have only one video in 2022. I'm like, is that right? I tried to do the best research I can. This video is already over 40 minutes, I'm sure. So you know what, we'll keep it to this. Okay, top 10 in 2022. Clarity So Amazing. Yep, really did love that palette. Was using that palette quite a bit. I wouldn't say this is a favorite palette right now, but I do love the shimmers in that palette. I still think like it serves a purpose. It would be fun to go out with from time to time if we're relating to, you know, like it's good. Cleota Dragon Fruit. I reached for this a lot in 2023, probably more in 2023 even than 2022. My packaging broke, so I've since depotted, and I actually do have one of the shades from that palette on my eyes today. I think for a fun, like, I think that was a really fun palette. Like, definitely a fun fling. Forever though, I mean, I still have the shades in my collection. I still do like them, especially if I'm reaching for like a fun pop of something. So take with that what you will. I mentioned the Adept Plain Jane Remastered. Great palette. Adept definitely has better now, so this would not be a top favorite. I mentioned the Patrick Ta 2 palette. I'm really surprised I don't see Patrick Ta 1 mentioned, unless that's missing from my top whatever in 2020 that I'm jump scaring you with. I did like the Patrick Ta 2. I think he makes a great formula. I'm definitely someone who likes browns more than rosy tones though, so, but I know we're talking about just palettes that I purchased in 2022. Like, that's the top 10 of palettes I purchased in 2022. ABH Nuevo. I was really impressed with this palette. I still enjoy using it. It wouldn't be a tippity top favorite. Odin's Eye Christmas Eve, yes, still a wonderful palette. It did not make it into my current top 15, but that is a palette I still get excited to reach for, especially as I've gotten more and more into blues. I think it's a beautiful palette. Danessa Myricks Lightwork Volume 3. We're up to 8 still favorites. Over half of my current favorites have been favorites in years past. I say so much about this, I need to just zip my lips. Love that. Huda Empowered. Oh yeah, that came out in 2022. This, I like definitely Huda Rose Quartz more. Huda Empowered is still a great palette though. There's some shades I really do love in there. Odin's Eye Hella, still a favorite. One of my most reached for palettes since this came into my collection, so you know it's good. And then Odin's Eye Merry Christmas. Also such a great palette, especially for something bold and punchy on the eye. I do really love that one. It didn't make my current top 10, but it would be like right up there in like my top 20 palettes, because I was going between Merry Christmas and Hella. But then I was like, I've reached for this one so much more. Okay, and then we are on to 2023. I have 1, 2, 3 videos from 2023, and then this video will actually be over, you guys. I hope you're having fun. Okay, 2023, we had, the first video was 10 palettes I've saved. We did 10 palettes I'd save if my house was burning to the ground. We had Glaminatrix Nearly Natural. You know, this might still be a favorite, but we're talking now about like literally last year's favorite, so I would hope they're still like somewhat favorites. Natasha Denona Glam. Natasha Denona I Need a Nude has since come out. I personally would save I Need a Nude over Glam. I actually have Glam on my eyes today as well though. Natasha Denona Gold, still saving it. Still saving it after all these years. Huda Rose Quartz, we're also saving. Natasha Denona Yucca, we are also saving. This also might still be a favorite. Glamlight Ice Cream, yep, definitely, especially for color. Plus there's so many shades in that palette. Then I also mentioned the Cake palette is one that I would save. Again, a perfect rainbow palette to have in the collection, great quality. Odin's Eye Xmas palette, Merry Christmas palette, yep, really love it. Danessa Myricks Lightwork Volume 3. Yep, we're still saving it. And then the Adept Cosmetics Ninhadrin palette. We are absolutely saving this beauty. All right, then in 2023, I posted a video, 10 best palettes of all time. Let's see what repeats we have in here. We have Tartelette in Bloom. Yes. We have Natasha Denona, I Need a Nude. Yes. We have Natasha Denona Gold. We have NARS Summer Solstice. We have Persona Identity 1. We have Kaleidos Sashimi City. We have ABH Jackie. We have Danessa Myricks Lightwork Volume 3. We have Odin's Eye Merry Christmas. We have Huda Beauty Rose Quartz. And then we also have the Dose of Colors Friendcation palette. So I kind of nailed it. I did not do research. I did not do research for those top 10 palettes of all time. I just went with my heart. Clearly we're seeing who the actual still eligible bachelors are. Am I annoying you guys yet with like all of my like whatever dumb relations? Okay. And then my 2023 ranking. So these were palettes that I tried in 2023. My top 10 ranked. We had Glaminatrix Nearly Natural came in at number 1. We have the Unearthly Fall Magic palette. Okay, that is a top palette, and I am just so excited for everything that Unearthly is going to come out with. That did not make my top 15, but that also has been a palette that hasn't been in my collection very long, and over time I could see that or Sorcerer's Smoke becoming one of my favorite palettes as well. Natasha Denona Yucca was a top palette. ColourPop Muppets, that is such a good palette as well. Unfortunately, I know you can't get that one anymore, but that was a good one. It's Belle, the Flare palette, for an all shimmer 9-pan palette. I am so impressed with that eyeshadow palette, and I'm definitely interested in trying more from that brand. Danessa Myricks Lightwork Volume 5. I just love the Danessa Myricks Lightwork palettes. We have the Pat McGrath Moonlit Seduction palette. So this, I believe, is one of the last palettes. Yes, one of the last palettes. I think all of my current favorites are gonna make it from previous favorites or previous videos. We have the ABH Cosmos palette. Love. Odin's Eye Stone and Rock, as well as the Odin's Eye Halloween collection were both mentioned as top palettes. And then the last palette is the Glaminatrix Rich Romantic palette, which is really beautiful. I definitely like the Nearly Natural palette better, but I still really enjoy, especially like the shifty shades in the Rich Romantic. Chef's kiss. But those are all of the palettes that I've loved before. If you guys made it to the end of the video, like, honestly, props to you. I hope that you had fun and enjoyed. If you have other palette themed ideas or content you want to hear from me, let me know. I actually had so much fun making this video, like the most fun I've had making a video in a really long time. We'll see how editing goes, but it's always just exciting when like you are just have so much fun filming a video. So let me know what other palette themed content you guys would like to see. I am prepping for my palette week, which will be the end of March, so would love to know what kind of videos you guys want to see there. That is going to wrap it up for today's video. Thank you guys so much for sticking around to watch and for supporting me and my channel as you guys always do. I love you guys so much, and I will catch you in my next video. Bye.